Hello, we just finished up with our meeting or Zoom meeting, and I told you I would finish reading Donovan's word jar. So I'm going to finish reading you Donovan's word jar. Okay, before in the story, we know that the problem in the story was Donovan had too many words to fit in his word jar and he couldn't fit anymore. So now we're going to finish the reading. Okay. So we're on chapter 6, Donovan's departure. Donovan was reading when he heard his father's footsteps in the hall. He got up from his chair and he tiptoed across the room. He didn't want Nikki to wake up. They had played with his words until she picked the word lullaby. To give her a hint, Donovan sang her a song. Nikki was so tired from playing that she fell asleep. Donovan's father opened the door and peeped into Nikki's room. Donovan put his finger to his lips to keep his father from speaking. He picked up his jar and followed his father down the stairs and into the kitchen. "How are you doing, partner?" his father asked. "Fine, and Nikki's feeling a lot better," Donovan said quickly. Before his father could ask another question, Donovan rushed on. "Can I go over to Grandma's and visit? It's really important." Donovan didn't want to waste another minute. He had fun keeping Nikki company, but now he wanted to get his problem solved. "Okay, but you watch yourself crossing the street in the rain," his dad said. "And Donovan, why don't you ask your grandma if she's free to come to dinner tonight? Tell her I'm doing the cooking," he added. "I will," Donovan called over his shoulder. He was already pulling on that shiny green slicker rain hat and his yellow rubber boots. He tucked his word jar in the crook of his arm. He thought if his grandma could see his problem, it might help her to come up with a great idea. Donovan opened the kitchen door and stepped out into the steady drizzle. Chapter 7, Donovan Dines. Donovan pushed open the heavy glass door to the Mellow View Apartments. He smiled at Mr. Bill Gutt, the security guard, as he signed his name in the guest book. Donovan pushed the button and got onto the elevator. His grandma lived on the 4th floor. Donovan didn't like where Grandma lived now. Everyone there seemed so gloomy. He wondered if all senior citizens' apartment buildings were like that. He missed the big house that Grandma used to live in, with its front porch and large backyard. Grandma had decided that her old house was too large after Grandpa died, so she sold it and moved. Now Grandma lived in the senior citizens building just a few blocks from where Donovan lived. He could see her anytime he wanted, and that was the best thing about her new apartment. Donovan knocked on the apartment door and waited. When his grandma opened the door and saw him, she smiled. "Donnie, what a pleasant surprise," Grandma said, opening the door wider. "It's nice to see you. Come in." Donovan went inside and began to take off his coat. He looked around Grandma's apartment. His grandma was a collector, too. She collected anything given to her by family and friends. Donovan thought this was a silly idea the first time she explained it to him, but then he decided that he liked the way Grandma's different collections blended together. Her apartment reminded him of a patchwork quilt, colorful, warm, and cozy. Old-fashioned dolls and lace-trimmed dresses were propped up against an assortment of pretty teapots. Strange seashells of different shapes and sizes surrounded potted philodendron, ivy, and African violets in small clay pots. Those are all flowers, right? Well, plants. Tin cans with faded labels from long, long ago shared a shelf with tiny ceramic animals. Grandma also collected fancy old hats. She had a large felt hat with lots of peacock feathers. Another hat was box-shaped and covered with a veil. The veil was sprinkled with lots of glittery stars. In the bands of some of her hats, Grandma had stuck postcards friends had sent her from faraway places. One postcard invited her to sunny, funny Acapulco. Another postcard said that things were just dandy in Dixieland. Donovan's favorite place in Grandma's apartment was her picture wall. Here, she displayed photographs of people she knew and liked. Grandma said that if she had not seen a person for a long time, she would visit them on her wall. So whenever he missed his grandpa, Donovan would go to the wall and visit him. Donnie, Grandmother called from the kitchen, would you like to have some lunch? Is it soup? Donovan loved Grandma's soup. Yes, it's your favorite. I have plenty of crackers, Grandma answered. Did you call your dad and let him know that you got here safely? Grandma asked. Not yet. I'm getting ready to do it now. I'll tell Dad I'm staying for lunch, Donovan said. He wondered which of his favorite soups Grandma had fixed. He had so many. Chapter 8, Donovan's Disappointment. After lunch, Donovan set his jar on the dining room table and explained his problem to his grandma. When he finished talking, he sat back in his chair and waited for her solution. Grandma reached over and plucked a few slips of paper from Donovan's jar. She looked at a slip of paper and laughed. Donnie, Grandma said, do you remember when Pooh traded your ice cream cone for a broken kite? I won't ever forget that, Donovan said, frowning. Grandma showed him the word bamboozle, and they both laughed. And this word emporium? Grandma said, shaking her head slowly. It makes me think of long ago when I was a young girl. I used to buy licorice at Mr. McCready's store. She selected another word from the jar. Donnie, where did you get this word? She asked. She was surprised to see kaleidoscope written on the slip of paper. I haven't seen one of those in years. I wonder if kids still play with them. I have never seen a kaleidoscope, Grandma, but I saw a picture of one in an old catalog. That's where I found the word, Donovan answered. Grandma, read several more words before she looked at Grandma read several more words before she looked at Donovan over the rims of her wire glasses. Donnie, she said, you sure got yourself a treasure here. This is a wonderful collection of words. Donovan smiled and sat up a little straighter. Grandma's praise made him feel good, but Donovan still needed a solution to his problem. Do you see my problem, Grandma? He asked. I thought of getting a larger jar, but that would only get full too. Well, honey, what do other collectors do when their collections grow too large? She asked. I don't know, Donovan said. He thought about it for a minute. Well, Pooh collects buttons, but he never gets too many because he trades them for other things. Like what? Grandma asked. Sometimes he trades for a poster or for a few comics. Once he traded 3 buttons for a t-shirt, Donovan explained. You think you could do that? Grandma asked. No, Grandma, I can't think of anything I could get worth my words, he said. And I really don't want to give any of my words away, he added. Grandma settled back in her chair. She didn't say anything for a long while, and Donovan began to feel a little uneasy. Maybe, just maybe, his grandma didn't have a solution. She dipped her hand back into the word jar and pulled out a few more words. There are some words in this jar that I know folks living here could use, she said. Donovan slipped to the edge of his chair and wondered what his grandma was going to say. She continued. Now, I like the word persnickety. That word fits Mrs. Mary Lou to a T. That woman has everything she That woman has to have everything she does just right. Grandma slipped another word from the jar. Cantankerous. That is a perfect word for our guard, Bill Gutt. I'll bet he argues with flies. Grandma laughed and Donovan joined in. He loved the sound of his grandmother's laughter. After they caught their breaths, Grandma said, I enjoyed your words, Donnie, and I'm sure a lot of people would. She smiled at him and waited to see if he had something to say. Grandma, I'd be glad to let any of your friends see my words, but they couldn't keep them. I'd have to have them back for my collection. Donovan's voice was firm. Well, I am sorry if I didn't help you. Oh, Grandma, that's okay, Donovan answered, trying hard not to show his disappointment. He did not want to hurt his grandma's feelings. Besides, he said, getting up from the table, if we don't have a solution today, maybe you'll think of something tomorrow. Grandma helped him with his boots, hat, and coat. Donovan picked up his word jar and tucked it firmly under his arm. Grandma walked him to the door. Take care of yourself, word gatherer, she said, hugging him close. Chapter 9, Donovan's Diplomacy. In the elevator, Donovan thought about his word jar. It had taken months, weeks, days, and hours to fill it. Deciding which words to keep was hard. Then Donovan checked the spelling and made sure he understood what each new word meant. What had his grandmother been thinking of? It seemed like she wanted him to just give his words away. He loved his word collection, but he had to think of a way to handle it, now that it was growing so large. The elevator doors opened, and Donovan stepped into the lounge. He saw 3 of Grandma's neighbors sitting around the television set. They didn't seem to care much what was on, and there was Mr. Perkins sitting by the window, looking at the raindrops hitting the window pane. Miss Millie had a magazine opened on her lap, but she wasn't reading it. Mr. Crawford, the mailman, was sitting on a hassock rubbing his feet. He looked as if he couldn't take another step. No one in the room was talking to or looking at each other, except Ms. Mary Lou and Mr. Bill Gutt. They were standing at the security guard's desk arguing very loudly. No one else was paying any attention to them. As Donovan walked closer, he could hear every word they said. Miss Mary Lou, this lounge will open or close when I say so, Mr. Bill Gutt said in a gruff voice. Well, I am telling you, Bill, that's a mistake. That should be decided by the people who live here, she answered back. I'm the guard, and I say what goes on in this lounge, Mr. Bill Gutt bellowed. Well, I live here, and I say that people who live here should set the time, Ms. Mary Lou said almost as loudly. Donovan looked from one to the other. They both began to shout at the same time, since neither one was listening to what the other one was saying. Donovan set his word jar on the corner of the desk and dug around inside the jar until he found a certain word. He tugged Ms. Mary Lou's sleeve and then Mr. Bill's jacket. They both looked down, surprised to see Donovan standing there. I think you two need this word, Donovan said in a stern voice. They both looked at the yellow slip of paper in Donovan's hand. Ms. Mary Lou giggled, and Mr. Bill Gutt smiled. Well, Mary Lou, what time do you think is a good time to open? Mr. Bill Gutt asked, scratching his head. Bill, I checked with a couple of people and they suggested 10 o'clock. What do you think of that? Ms. Mary Lou asked, smiling at Bill Gutt. Donovan let out a sigh of relief. He had come at just the right time. They needed the word compromise. Ms. Mary Lou and Mr. Bill weren't shouting anymore. They were talking to each other quietly. They were coming to an agreement. That sure made Donovan feel good. His word had been just what they needed. Donovan suddenly remembered that his father had asked him to invite Grandma to dinner. He ran back to the elevator and pushed the up button. Chapter 10, Donovan's Delight. Back so soon? Grandma asked, opening the door. I thought you had gone home. I forgot to invite you to dinner tonight. Dad is going to cook. Do you want to come around? Donovan asked. It didn't take Grandma long to make up her mind. She loved Donovan's father's cooking. Well, I certainly do. In fact, why don't I just get my coat and walk with you, Grandma suggested. Maybe we could talk about your word jar a little bit more, she said. Donovan waited while Grandma got her coat and locked her apartment door. She was carrying a big brown paper sack, and he wondered what was in it. As they walked down the hall, Donovan began to tell Grandma about how he had helped Ms. Mary Lou and Mr. Bill Gunt. When Grandma and Donovan got to the lounge, Donovan could not believe what he saw. Grandma's neighbors were up and around, laughing and talking. They all seemed excited. He looked around to see what was going on. Donovan saw that they were waving their little yellow slips of paper in their hand. My words! They have my words! Donovan shouted. Some people had one slip of paper in their hands. Others had two. Mr. Avery was no longer slumped in front of the TV. He was tacking one of Donovan's words up on a bulletin board. Miss Millie was looking up at the word on her slip of paper in a pocket dictionary. Donovan looked over the desk and saw Mrs. Agnes digging into his word jar. There were people in a line behind her laughing and talking. They were waiting to get a word from his jar. What is going on? Donovan asked as loud as he could. Grandma, stop them. They're taking my words. He turned to his grandma, but she looked just as surprised as he felt. Donnie, calm down. They didn't know you left a jar on the desk, she said in a quiet voice. I am going to get my word jar, Donovan said firmly. Excuse me, he shouted. Excuse me. May I get past? He yelled, moving through the crowd. He pushed a little and even shoved a bit. It was no use. Donovan couldn't stop what was happening. Mr. Crawford, the mailman, passed Donovan and waved his word over his head. Perseverance, he called out. That's just the word I needed. Some days I get so tired I can hardly make it. I'm going to try just a little harder to keep going, he said, tucking the word in his shirt pocket. Donovan stopped pushing and stood still. Wow, one of my words made Mr. Crawford feel better, Donovan said. He looked around and saw Miss Millie talking to Mr. Foote. Donovan was surprised. Boisterous, he heard Miss Millie say in her soft voice. Grandma always told Donovan that Miss Millie was so shy that she hardly ever spoke to anyone. Mr. Foote, on the other hand, spoke to everyone. Well, I'll be, Mr. Foote said in surprise. My word is timid. Perhaps we should exchange words, Miss Millie suggested. Oh, no. Maybe I need to quiet down some. Sometimes I am a bit loud, Mr. Foote said softly. You're right. I think I'll keep my word, too. I'm going to start speaking to people more. I'm going to change my ways. Miss Millie's voice sounded like she'd vented. Did my words do that? Make them want to change? Donovan asked himself in surprise. All around him, Grandma's neighbors were laughing and talking to each other. They had never acted so lively before. Nicky was right. Words can make people feel better, Donovan said quietly. Donovan! Ms. Mary Lou called out as she walked over and stood next to him. Your words are wonderful. I just couldn't help myself. After you gave Bill and me a word, I I got carried away. I just gave Mr. Kincaid the word leisure. That man works entirely too hard, she said, smiling. And Donovan, people just started coming up and asking for words. And if they didn't get one they wanted, they just traded it. She looked so pleased. It was hard for Donovan not to smile. Mr. Bilgott came over and pinched Donovan's cheek. Mr. Perkins patted his shoulder. Everyone wanted to thank him for sharing his words. Donovan felt as if the sun had come out inside him. Mr. Bilgott pointed to the empty jar on the desk and said, "Looks like we cleaned you out, young fellow." When Grandma pushed through the crowd, she looked worried. "Donovan, are all your words gone?" she asked. "Honey, I am so sorry. I know you didn't want to give your words away. Maybe you could ask them for them back," she said. Donovan looked up at her and smiled. "Grandma, they love my words. The words made them talk to each other." "Look," he said, pointing to Mr. Foote and Miss Millie. "They are talking to each other." Donovan was so excited. "And Grandma, Mr. Crawford, the mailman, doesn't look so tired anymore." Grandma looked around to see the room and smiled. "Donnie, you know, Mr. Mike got the word chortle, and I actually heard him giggle," she said, laughing. "But Donnie, they didn't give you anything for your words." Grandma was still worried. "Yes, they did. They made me feel like a magician. My words changed them." The sunshine Donovan felt inside was shining all over his face. Grandma set the larger paper sack she had been carrying on the desk and pulled a large glass jar from it. Donovan stopped smiling and caught his breath. "Grandpop's humidor," he exclaimed. No one had been allowed to touch the jar when Grandpa had been alive. No one except Donovan and Grandpop himself. Donovan would climb up on his grandpa's lap and lean over and get something from the jar, and then very carefully, Donovan would put the wooden lid back on. Grandma wrote on a slip of paper, removed the wooden lid from the jar, and dropped the paper in. "This is for you." "Word gatherer," Grandma said, her voice full of pride. Donovan took the slip of paper from the jar. On one side it said, "A happy accident," and on the other side the word serendipity was written. Donovan looked around. Everyone was watching his grandma and him. He hugged Grandma until it hurt. He would be proud to put his word jar collection in Grandpop's jar. Donovan was going to have a wonderful time collecting new words. It would take hours, days, weeks, maybe even months. But the next time his jar filled up, he would not have a problem. It would be fun finding new ways to give his words away. And that is the end. So, tell me, what was the problem in this story? Good. Donovan had too many words. He was collecting too many words to even fit in his jar anymore. And how did they resolve the problem at the end? Okay, they resolved the problem by Grandma giving him a huge jar for his words. And the people at the center where his grandma lived, her neighbors, went through the jars and picked words that they liked and traded, and it made them smile and be happy and lively again. I hope you enjoyed this book. We'll see you next time. Bye.